A pleasant afternoon, sisters and brothers. May I invite everyone to stand up for our universal prayer. O hidden life, vibrant in every atom. O hidden light, shining in every creature. O hidden love, embracing all in oneness. May all who feel themselves as one with Thee know they are therefore one with every other. Thank you. Please be seated. And again, a pleasant afternoon, sisters and brothers. We shall now start our public lecture. And for today, the lecture is entitled Individuation and Global Responsibility, the Subtle Magic of Lincoln, Eisenhower, and Mandela. Normally, if I were to introduce a guest speaker, I would ask for a synopsis of the lecture. But because of this intriguing title, I sought it not to ask for a synopsis to avoid any spoilers for you nor for me. So for today, I will just have the privilege of introducing our guest speaker, who is a committed student of the dynamic, sublime, and therapeutic philosophy of Theosophy. He has had the distinct honor of participating in concert with devoted and brilliant co-workers in the diverse, innovative work of the United Lodge of Theosophists in Santa Barbara in California. In particular, it has been his immense privilege to explore the rich, multivalent teachings of Theosophia, or divine wisdom. This was under the luminous and compassionate tutelage of Sri Raghavan Iyer and Nandini Iyer. In addition to engaging in numerous creative modes of disseminating the vibrant ethics of theosophical thought for the sake of the human family, he has taught courses over the years in religion, philosophy, ethics, and politics in the Oxnard College. He has also given numerous public presentations on Lincoln, Gandhi, Mandela, and other statesmen at the eminent Institute of World Culture in Santa Barbara. So, brothers and sisters, let us all welcome our guest speaker for today, Dr. James Tepfer. Doctor.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is truly a pleasure, as well as a privilege, to be able to speak to you this evening about the topic that's been chosen. And first, as I always do in terms of the wonderful tradition of ancient Aryavata, of saluting and honoring those whom one feels deeply indebted to, I would like to first begin by extending my gratitude to Tim Boyd, our international president, who works tirelessly for the noblest of all human causes, universal brotherhood. Thank you, Tim. And I'd like to thank two, actually, if I could, Idharmas and Marja, who are consistently helpful to all of us, who contribute essays for publications or who attempt to prepare for conferences. I would like to offer the garland of gratitude to all those luminous teachers of the past who gave us soul-saving teachings and were such resplendent examples of the spiritual life. Krishna, Buddha, Christ, Mahavira, Muhammad, Rumi, and a constellation of other wise and compassionate teachers. Each one promulgated some facet of Theosophia, the wisdom religion. And every true devotee of these pristine religions contributes to and enriches the legacy of humanity as we move into the uncharted waters of the future. In this deeper sense, there is no such thing as a non-theosophist. We are all seekers of spiritual truth, and we are all brothers and sisters of the human family. I would also like to offer my profoundest gratitude to both H.P. Blavatsky of the 1875 cycle and Sri Raghavan Iyer and Nandini Iyer of the 1975 cycle. As to H.P. Blavatsky, she was remarkable in every way. She was par excellence the courageous purveyor of the teachings of the Brotherhood of Bodhisattvas in the 19th century. She had no immediate predecessor nor successors commensurate with her occult stature. She continues to be the spiritual gold standard of that most precious of all virtues, fidelity to the wisdom teachers behind the Theosophical movement and to their iridescent teachings. She remains today an unwavering beacon light for all students of wisdom and virtue across our beloved, troubled globe. The coming of the 1975 cycle brought with it two remarkable souls, Sri Raghavan and Nandini Iyer. For those of us who had the privilege of knowing Nandini, she was truly a marvel. She possessed the most acute and far-reaching philosophical intelligence that one had ever encountered. She was an Oxford Don and a theosophical teacher all in one. With respect to the former, one of her Oxford tutors referred to her in a letter of commendation as one of the finest philosophical minds that Oxford had ever produced. With respect to theosophy, Nandini was so brilliant in her intuitive grasp of the theosophical philosophy and its indissoluble bond with the world's religions that one can easily imagine a Plato sitting at her feet in radiant admiration and gratitude. But beyond her mastery of all things conceptual, Nandini was, in a sense, Sita come again. She was spiritual royalty. Her heart was as pure as the virgin snow, and it seemed to be one of oceanic depths. She was unflinchingly loyal to H.P. Blavatsky, and like the latter, lived and breathed for the amelioration of the human race. She was indeed what her consort Sri Raghavan once said of her. She is a golden Kshatriya, the embodiment of spiritual fearlessness, ethical purity, and intellectual integrity. Sri Raghavan Iyer was the sacrificial Promethean forerunner of the universal civilizations yet to come. He was wisdom and magnanimity incarnate. In this respect, he exemplified a multitude of supernal Aquarian qualities. He was, in one sense, if I may say so, very Indian. He was spiritual, cultured, brilliant, and full of the graces that immediately reminded one of ancient Aryavata and of golden ages long past. He was also very English. He was confident, highly educated, extremely literate, and at ease with statesmen, scientists, educators, and royalty. He was also very American. He was a true and fearless rebel, innovative, resourceful, visionary, and, very importantly, the eternal friend of the common man. But beyond all this, he was also, how shall I put it, the universal man, original, sui generis, and timeless. His sympathies were always compassionately inclusive, and his repeated emphasis from first to last was to draw the larger circle through the magic of selfless action. Speaking of magic, let us now turn to the evening's topic for consideration: individuation and global responsibility, the subtle magic of Lincoln, Eisenhower, and Mandela. Sri Raghavan Iyer, in his pioneering book, Parapolitics Toward the City of Man, tells us that true statesmen are what? True statesmen are dreamers of the dreams of men. He also intimates that the very greatest statesmen can be more than dreamers. They can be magicians of the heart. A magician, we are told, can be seen as an awakener and a precipitator of the latent, unseen wisdom and goodness in human beings. In fact, a magician is one who can, by a conscious act of his rationally directed imagination, help turn the forces of evil to good. Nonetheless, a statesman can neither be a visionary nor a magician unless he or she is intellectually and morally individuated to some appreciable degree. Let me be clear on a point. The theme about responsibility and interconnection is a really profound and wonderful theme for everyone to be thinking about, to be contemplating, because the situation in the world as we know, and the surface, seems to be very anything but connected and feeling connected, and all the good that flows from that. So this notion of the interconnectedness and of individuating is extremely important. And this is what I'm going to explore for just a few minutes, the notion of individuating within a society, within a community, within a global community. And that's extremely important because it also makes the basis for the subtle form of magic, of transformation of human suffering, and of human possibilities, and of unknown human potential that has to be saluted and embraced and pointed to before people can reestablish their center. So what then does it mean to individuate? What does it mean to increasingly become a rational and moral agent in a given society? To individuate is to expand the circumference of thoughtful initiatives for the good of all. It is the willingness to bravely and unselfishly assume responsibility for the needs and suffering of others. This is not easy. It is challenging and painful because our ego, with its self-centeredness, perverse will, and tendency to rationalize its weaknesses, gets in the way. Because of this particular problem, the unbounded, multi-dimensional spirit in man is rarely aroused to any significant degree in modern civilization. We are, in a Socratic sense, sleepwalking through life. Yet, in moments of crippling social crisis, the spirit in man often wakes up and inspires us to act with resolve and daring. When it does, it can leave us in a state of amazement and wonder. To our delight, we rediscover that individual human beings can be surprisingly self-surpassing, courageous, and compassionate. They can most unexpectedly rise above both ego and the limits of society. Let me illustrate the notion of responsibly transcending ego and society, individuating, by citing an example from ancient history. We have the true story of magic in action as told by the eminent Greek historian Edith Hamilton. It is the tale of a Spartan officer, Sparta, who engaged in an act that was both wise and uncharacteristically compassionate. It is an especially remarkable story because ancient Sparta, in contrast to ancient Athens, was a highly structured, militaristic city-state, which allowed little room for individual creativity in thought and morals, and resisted social change of any sort. The tale goes like this, and it's rooted in historical evidence. Sorry. It's the evening before the Spartan army is going to descend from the hills and finish razing Athens to the ground. There are campfires all around Athens. At one of the campfires sits the generals. They've just finished their meal. Now, there's an officer who's responsible for providing entertainment to the generals after their dinner. Now, this particular officer has been ruminating, thinking. There's something in him that can't bring him to encourage the destruction of Athens. And he's been pondering this. What can he do? He has to be careful. He's a Spartan. Spartans don't individuate. They're very much considered people who must hold the line of everything that is Spartan. What he does is, he, for the night's entertainment, tells the generals, I'm going to read to you a soliloquy. I'm going to read to you a passage from a play that I think you will appreciate. So he reads for 15 minutes this marvelous tribute to fidelity to family and especially to state. And it moves the generals. They're all nodding their heads. And finally, when he's over, the person in charge of the whole state of Sparta says, my good officer, what Spartan could possibly have been so eloquent? We are known for many things, but eloquence in literature is not one of them. And this is when the officer took courage in both hands, and he said, General, I must tell you, this is by the great Athenian playwright Sophocles. There was quiet for quite a while. And finally, the head general, the Spartan leader, gentlemen, it seems to me that any city that can give birth to a man who understands what it means to be faithful, to have fidelity to what is so essential and important, we should spare them. Agreed. That means to tell your officers and tell your men, no one is to touch the Acropolis. Do not destroy the architecture or the statuary. If we're going to honor them, we should at least leave them that. Now today, if you go, you can thank the Spartan officer. It was his courage and his ability to wisely choose what would move the heart, resulting in a change. This was very unusual for a Spartan to do. They were fed up with Athens anyway. Athens was so arrogant. But that one passage, because of the imagination and the courage of one Spartan, to both go beyond honoring, he was honoring the Athenians as human beings. He'd been to Athens. He'd seen the marvelous statues of Phidias. He'd seen their magnificent architecture and their brilliance and the design and the designing intelligence behind it. He'd seen something of what we would call the divine in a human, expressed in a human form. It was said if you stood in front of the statue that Phidias sculpted, you could not help but be uplifted. Your whole mood would be uplifted. You would be elevated because it was so amazing how he made a physical form reflect something of the divine efflux. So this courageous young man, this officer, was able to touch the hearts of all. Now, one of the interesting things about this historical example is that we have edged into the heady domain of the metaphysical and the metapsychological. How so? Well, once we acknowledge the potential for each individual to transcend both ego and culture, we've engaged in a quantum shift in thought and in perspective. We are admitting that we are not only self-aware, rational, responsible agents, but we are also self-surpassing beings. We are capable of consciously setting aside our name-informed self, our limiting personal experience, our mental habits, and our cultural mores. More importantly, we are acknowledging the fact that we are able to affect others for the greater good, that others, by virtue of our insightful actions, are able to rise above themselves and their culture, and thereby change for the better, even if it's only for a moment. Now, when we individuate, morally reshape ourselves, and dedicate ourselves to that which is at the heart of the human endeavor, when we do that, and we open ourselves to the potential for the moral and intellectual growth that's possible in all, something interesting happens. There's a kind of alchemy that takes place. How shall I put this? When we individuate intellectually and morally, we begin the mysterious process of assimilating the immortal self within us. Theosophically speaking, this immortal self is a bountiful center within the hidden depths of consciousness. It is dimensionless. It is the source of self-transcendence. It is capable of infinite compassion. And that is why we are able to perpetually expand our sense of self to include more and more people of diverse qualities and in adverse conditions. The immortal self is all-knowing, replete with creative powers, completely fearless, and unconditionally compassionate. Furthermore, this immortal self is said to slough off its mortal vestures periodically, only to assume new ones in its great return pilgrimage to the source of all life. So, when we consciously strive to think more comprehensively and with greater depth about the welfare of the disenfranchised, we expand the perimeters of the embodied self, as well as intensify our sense of responsibilities for others. This invisible process of individuating can culminate over an unspecified period of time in a second birth, a mental incarnation of our higher creative and intuitive faculties. This in turn releases a divine efflux that elevates those individuals within the radius of our increasingly refined consciousness. To put this another way, when I was considering this, before we now go into considering something about these three marvelous statesmen, individuation is really the process of becoming more universal in thought, feeling, and action. In a Platonic sense, the more universal, the more we are able to merge our mind with the divine, eternal man within. Furthermore, the more universal we become, the more we are able to focus on particular individuals and propose actions with greater insight and sympathy. We do not see people in terms of limiting categories, but as immortal souls with unknown and untapped potential. To pause a moment. Have any of you ever found it difficult when you're meeting someone for the first time not to acquire an impression that is a reflection of their gender, caste, age, condition, etc.? It's very hard to see someone in some quintessential, fundamental manner, particularly as you get to know them. But that is precisely what the person who is becoming more attuned to the higher individuality of the immortal soul within is able to do. Because they've universalized their thought and purified their feelings and thought monastically about many things connected with humanity, they have the spontaneous ability to intuit something about people that is going to be almost always on their side, regardless of the conditions and the impressions they receive. They simply do not see people, they know how to see people as individuals, which is extremely difficult. That's the paradox of universality. The more universal, the more you're able to see the particular pure and simple, not through a diverse set of conditions, because our consciousness gets fragmented. And we get caught in images and categories of thought that we have to work through before we are able to see someone in a more pristine, sublime light that reflects something of the immortal divine within. Now, it should be evident from what has been said that genuine magic calls for highly individuated individuals who are both creative and responsive to the needs of others. Furthermore, the magic they bring about is not the magic of the Las Vegas illusionist. He deceives our senses in order to entertain us. It is not the magic of those who possess and display psychic powers, such as telepathy, telekinesis, and the like. They amaze us, perhaps, but they stimulate an unhealthy curiosity about psychic powers, and they do not affect our hearts or inspire us to engage in self-sacrificial action for the benefit of others. Nor are we speaking here of the magic of physical healing, such as performed by Jesus or Apollonius of Tyana. One engaged in human magic is one who awakens the deeper heart quality within us, the will to serve and engage the world courageously and creatively. Since the heart has several layers, ranging from passions to aspirations, let us call the deeper layer that the magician touches the alpha dimension of the heart. It is that heart center that is benevolent, transformative, and makes spiritual, moral, and intellectual growth possible. The true magician, then, has the soul wisdom to help fertilize this invisible center in the hidden chamber of the heart. It is up to us to make wise use of the karmic opportunities he or she gives us. Now, let's turn to specifically what I'd like to do is to invoke the blessings of the Raja Rishis of ancient times, the king initiates referred to by Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita when he points to the Guru Parapara, the sacred spiritual lineage of enlightened teachers of which the Raja Rishis are an integral part. The king initiates of ancient epochs exemplified the divinity as well as the dignity of true royalty, of enlightened rulership for the welfare of all. These eminent Kshatriyas exemplified all the sublime virtues and cultural graces which we yearn for in our troubled, turbulent times. Despite our authentic longings, we might easily doubt that such selfish, selfless individuals could actually exist untarnished in the political realm. Is it possible, we wonder, for even the most sincere politicians to be both wise witnesses and just participants in the complex world of modern politics? Yes, it is possible, as we shall see. Each of the three exemplary leaders that I have selected for our consideration this evening, Lincoln, Eisenhower, and Mandela, seem to qualify as statesmen who intellectually and morally individuated to such a remarkable degree that they became unconscious magicians in their own right. While they made no claims of being wise, much less of being magicians, they seem to meet most of the qualifications or preconditions for having a heart-transforming effect on the lives of others. All three were unconditionally committed to a compelling vision of a better world, and their respective visions became the thrice sacred flame that illuminated and guided them over the arc of their extraordinary lives. Lincoln, for example, saw America as a living experiment in democracy and was wholeheartedly pledged to extending the principles enunciated in its forgotten Declaration of Independence, namely the propositions of liberty and most especially of equality. Eisenhower foresaw the emergence of a new global order of the ages, in which the yoke of colonialism was to be cast aside and the United Nations was to become the primary civilizing agent for universal justice between nations. Mandela was committed to racial reconciliation, and he consciously risked alienating both black Africans and white Afrikaners in his conscientious efforts to bring about racial accord in South Africa. Let's turn to President Lincoln first. As we know, Lincoln and the brave white and colored soldiers of the Union Army freed 6 million slaves from lives of misery and degradation. But what is very little known is that Lincoln was more than a man of political action. He was also a gifted thinker. He was that rare breed, a moral thinker in the realm of politics. By the time he assumed the mantle of the presidency, he had individuated to a high moral and intellectual degree. He believed fervently in the politics of responsibility, of objective idealism. As he once told a friend, "I clarified my ethical principles by studying the teachings of Jesus, strengthened my ability to reason clearly by studying Euclid's geometrical propositions, and improved my understanding of politics from a careful reading of Shakespeare's plays." He was not an intellectual lightweight. More than that, while he was out riding around the countryside as a lawyer, spent hours and hours thinking about the propositions of the Declaration of Independence, which is so magnificent. How do you make it living? How do you bring it into the lives of people? How do you make it germane? How do you make it helpful? How do you make it transformative? How will we bring it together in such a way that we actually talk with each other in terms of both principles and practices and policies that mirror both? So he thought and thought and thought. So it is evident to the perceptive student of Lincoln that he had not only an alpha heart, but an alpha intellect as well. Therefore, it should not be surprising that his focused compassion, when syncopated with his versatile intelligence, could indeed be magical in the transforming effect on others. His magic, his alchemy, often manifested itself through the art of timely storytelling, and not only through acts of political self-transcendence. His stories, witticisms, and perceptive accounts of imagined and actual life incidents were numerous and diverse. Sometimes humorous stories or incidents were told to diffuse an atmosphere of hostility. For example, Lincoln was engaged in a series of very important debates throughout the state of Illinois. And he and Senator Douglas, who was the greatest orator of his time, actually, and people came to hear Douglas, not Lincoln. Lincoln was unknown relatively during these debates. Well, Douglas, in an area of Illinois where people were hostile, were supporting Douglas's slave theories and against what Lincoln was arguing for. They were a bit hostile to Lincoln. And then Douglas said, "You know, thing that's bothering me about Lincoln, I think he's a bit two-faced." So it came Lincoln's turn to make an argument. He stood up there and he looked at the audience, and they were looking at him all serious and ready to boo. And he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I leave it to you to make the decision. Am I two-faced or not? Do I have two faces, like Senator Douglas says I have? I ask you, if I had two faces, would I be wearing this one?" He was a very homely man, by the way. So they said, "Good one, Abe, good one." They could appreciate it. So he did that often. Lincoln's timely storytelling can be seen as magic of a democratic kind, magic that all of us do at times, especially with dear friends and in moments of soul serenity. Lincoln's instructive stories and witty tales were especially magical because they were often so unexpectedly revelatory and even life-changing to his listeners. Storytelling succeeded where logical reasoning and argument would most likely have had little effect on people's willingness to change moral direction. Once, when he was under a lot of burdens simultaneously, so many times, but he was sitting in the Oval Office pondering a very delicate situation involving Native Americans, which he, despite what you might hear, he was incredibly compassionate in that relation to that situation. Anyway, he had that on his mind. He had the Civil War going on his mind. He had this, he had that. And into his office come 5 senators, all full of bluster. And every one of them began to speak and tell him how he should change this policy, modify that policy. They were giving him advice right, left, and center. And he just sat there listening to them. And finally, he got up and said, "Gentlemen, please, quiet." So they went quiet. And he said, "Now, I want you to listen to this carefully." So they listened. He said, "Imagine there's a man standing right where I'm standing, in the middle of the room. But imagine a man standing, and all of you have taken everything you are worth financially and brought it down to a sack of gold. And let this man be holding this sack of gold close to his chest and dearly. But let's also imagine that this man is standing on a precipice, and he has to carry your gold from this side to the other side of the precipice. And let's assume there's a rope connecting the two sides. He, in all faith, begins to walk across the rope, carrying this gold. Now tell me, would you stand there on the side saying, 'Hey, bend a little bit'? No, stand up a little straighter. No, be sure and balance this way. Be sure and balance that way. Don't you think that would distract him?" Yeah. Gentlemen, I hold a most precious treasure, the well-being of our entire country. Please, let me carry it. Trust me, I will get to the other side, but let me carry it without contention. There was quiet. They nodded. "Thank you, Mr. President," and they left, never to come back, because he was able to make his point in a way that affected them and their understanding. That's a kind of magic. A kind of transformation has occurred. A quickening has occurred. A maturation has occurred. That's all to the good. Not many of us can do that very readily, particularly when we're burdened with so many other things. Beyond Lincoln's gift for tale-telling, Lincoln engaged in a subtler magic, that of purifying prejudices embedded in the public mind. For example, all Southerners are evil due to the cane mark of slavery. On one particular historical occasion, Lincoln was able to use inspired word magic to transmute the attitude of Northerners toward their Southern brothers and sisters. The specific transformative moment was when Union supporters gathered to celebrate the anniversary of the Union Army's turning point victory over the Confederate Army on the battlefield of Gettysburg. The brief commemorative that Lincoln finished writing on his way to Gettysburg and delivered amidst the controlled chaos of that festive occasion no doubt had a little immediate impact on his bustling audience. However, when what is known as the Gettysburg Address was later read by multitudes in the comforts of leisure and the quiet of solitude, the reverential tone of the Gettysburg Address, its invocation of pristine principles, and its universal sentiments enlightened the hearts and purified the minds of many, then and thereafter. The 10 sentences that make up Lincoln's 2-minute Gettysburg Address are truly mantramic, like the verses of Shelley's poetry or the meter of Shakespeare's Tempest. Lincoln's address is intuitively expressed in a cadence and rhythm that seem to faithfully mirror healing celestial harmonies. I don't know how many of you are familiar. Let me just read you 2 brief things from this address. He begins this way: 407 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Then he ends it. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion for that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Now, if you go to Disneyland in Anaheim, California, the original Disney, and you go into Disneyland and you go to the right, you'll see something called the President's Exhibit. And if you walk in there, they have these mannequins, mechanical mannequins that on a stage. And it's like a 15-minute presentation, and people go in and you sit down for about 15 minutes. And at the end, they have suddenly the president that stands up is Lincoln. And he delivers the Gettysburg Address. And the actor who's enacting it had a deep feeling for what Lincoln was saying. And when he gets through enunciating in that Buddhic eloquence the Gettysburg Address, there's not a single person who's come in there who isn't moved. You have just total silence. And everybody sits there for a few moments. A refreshing breeze, a wave came in all the chaos in Disneyland for just a moment and touched them and reminded them of something golden, pure, purifying, and wonderful. That America still breathes a spirit. It's not entirely lost. It's certainly going elsewhere in the globe. Americans just have to rediscover it. The rediscovery of America, so to speak. Indeed, Lincoln's eloquent peroration of the Gettysburg battlefield is truly a humble consecration, an offering to the gods of reconciliation, a eulogy to the nobility of all those soldiers who sacrificed for the cause in which each fervently believed. Heaven, by the way, is completely indifferent to the color of the soldiers' uniforms. It celebrates their valorous human spirit, not their personal allegiances. Lincoln did not separate out the Union dead from the Confederate dead. He was affecting already the consciousness of the Northerner, the Union advocates, to realizing the tragedy lies in every man's death, but each fervently believed in the cause for which he was willing to die. That's admirable, that's honorable. That's what it means to be American in the best sense. We don't have to agree if we have integrity and honesty and we're willing to do what is necessary. So he certainly did something to kind of purify the perceptions of people about the war, to help them see that there's a transcendent purpose to every country, really. But in America's case, to Lincoln, America stood for ages to come. That was his real focus. It was archetypal. It was architectonic. He was thinking decades and centuries ahead. Will a democratic experiment actually survive in the world? It's not an easy thing to do. And no one else had really tried it this way. So he was deeply concerned that the principles be enshrined in the hearts of people and rejuvenate them and help them see that self-sacrifice is essential for anything that you believe in fervently and that you know to be right and good and true. And so this is what Lincoln was able to do in his own way. Now, Dwight David Eisenhower did his own magic, both as a supreme Allied commander of Allied forces in World War II and as a two-term president of America. Eisenhower drew out the best from the common man, as well as elicited more than the best from the very best when it was most needed. There are numerous testimonials to the peculiar magnetic effect that many felt while being in the immediate orbit of Eisenhower's pulsating presence. Many noted an energy emanating from him that was almost palpable. Fortunately, his etheric efflux was not charismatic, seductive, or domineering in its effect. It was benign, warm, and welcoming. When he turned his full mental attention on you and spontaneously gave you his incandescent smile, it was simultaneously charming and disarming. But more than all this, Eisenhower had the true magician's ability to immediately win over your trust. He was easy to trust because he was so willing to give you his full, open-ended, sympathetic attention. Furthermore, he was unusual in that he was able to suspend the complex colorations of previous interactions and listen to you afresh. It was, with Eisenhower, like a perpetual first meeting. Past judgments were suspended, and prior disagreements were of no real consequence either. Every encounter was in some sense an original. At the moment of personal engagement, a bridge seemed to be welcomingly extended across the spaces between you both, and he was already crossing it to sit with you a while and discuss matters trivial or troublesome. Temperamentally speaking, the subtle light of dawn was almost always within and around Eisenhower. It was rarely nighttime. He was fundamentally an optimist who sloughed off moments of discouragement with relative ease. His inner luminosity drew friends a little closer and made enemies less distant and more receptive. He was, in a Buddhist and Socratic sense, the rarest of individuals. He was one who was morally awake, not only to conscience and principles, but to the hopes, aspirations, and felt needs of the diverse peoples he met and served. Now, here to me is kind of an extraordinary thing. The litmus test of Eisenhower's natural magic was his series of private meetings with whom? With Stalin at the end of World War II. Stalin, the most suspicious and paranoid of men, was notably struck with Eisenhower's character and conduct during the war. And after the defeat of the Nazis, Stalin invited Eisenhower to visit Moscow. Eisenhower accepted the invitation and flew to Moscow with General Zhukov, the brilliant Russian general whom Eisenhower felt was the primary reason the Allies defeated the Germans. Eisenhower spent a week in Moscow, and in addition to private conversations with Stalin, he was feted by the dictator in public. In fact, during a parade in Moscow, Stalin insisted that Eisenhower stand on Lenin's tomb, a privilege no non-communist foreigner had ever been accorded. When Eisenhower left Moscow later that week, Stalin told the US ambassador, "General Eisenhower is a very great man, not only because of his military accomplishments, but because of his human, friendly, kind, and frank nature. He's not a coarse, brusque man like most military people are." Clearly, there was magic in Eisenhower's way of relating to Stalin. Eisenhower's inner radiance, his trust, and his ability to instill trust, even in the most distrustful of men, was extraordinary. And most importantly, Eisenhower's ability to suspend judgment and treat Stalin as a human being who was just as much interested in peace as he was, made Stalin relax and confess to Eisenhower how much Russia needed the help of America after the war, not only monetarily, but in terms of the assistance of American scientists and technicians. Eisenhower was sympathetic and put Stalin at ease as very few could. For a magical moment, the two leaders became co-conspirators for the good of the world as well as for Mother Russia. Now, Nelson Mandela was a great admirer of President Lincoln and of Mahatma Gandhi. He studied both their lives meticulously. In fact, if you want to read an incredible summary of Gandhi's Satyagraha life, the best one to read is by Nelson Mandela. It appeared in Life magazine in the year 2000, I've forgotten which month, but it gives you the quintessence of Gandhi as a Satyagraha. And he says some of his faults, don't even pay attention to them. They're insignificant when you consider the incredible quality of love, compassion, courage, action, and his concern for the suffering of others. He said, that's not easy. It's inimitable. We should all celebrate the spiritual warrior, Gandhi. So he wrote this magnificent account. It was absolutely historically accurate. Anyway, like Gandhi, Mandela effected a revolutionary change of heart in the soul of a nation. In Mandela's case, it was a simultaneous transformation in the attitudes of both the black South African and the white Afrikaner. Mandela successfully exorcised the self-pitying demon of revenge in blacks and nonviolently slayed the hydra-head snake of fear in whites. Interestingly enough, Mandela unwittingly laid the basis for his future soul magic while he was in prison. Several years before he was released from Robben Island prison, he decided to study and master the Afrikaner language. He wished to better understand Afrikaners, learn their history, and if possible, communicate with them in their native tongue. As Mandela entered into the complicated mindset and history of the white South African minority, he realized that he had to understand, of all things, the white ruler's passion for what? For rugby. Rugby, as he discovered, could be a relatively easy means of engaging in non-political, non-confrontational conversation prior to discussing volatile political issues such as the black vote and the inevitable dismantling of apartheid in the years ahead. So accordingly, Mandela studied the history of rugby, learned its rules, and memorized all the names of past legendary as well as current team players. The South African rugby team was called the Springboks, and they were revered by the white Afrikaner. Understandably, they were hated with a passion by black South Africans who continually rooted against them whenever they were allowed to attend rugby games. Not only did the average black citizen disparage the team, but the African National Congress Party in South Africa managed to get the Springboks disqualified from ever participating in international competition. As a result, the Springboks could not compete for any world rugby title. That's hard to bear if you're a competitor, I can assure you. Mandela's occasion for creative magic did not form clearly in his mind until shortly after he was elected president. But from that point on, he began to consciously visualize, carefully think through, and progressively assemble all the characters necessary for his great play. It would be a deep drama of the human spirit, one worthy of an Aeschylus or a Shakespeare. And like the latter with The Tempest, Mandela was intent on bringing about a convergence of events that could conceivably transmute the lead of mutual hatred and distrust into the gold of respect and racial understanding. He wanted to awaken the conscience of the nation in different senses and bring about racial harmony and active tolerance. In brief, President Mandela managed to get the Springboks rugby team reinstated and eligible for international competition. He then managed to convince World Rugby to let South Africa host the next World Cup in Johannesburg. Just as importantly, Mandela by degrees won over the Springbok team. In particular, he won the affection and admiration of the Springboks captain, Francois Pienaar. He did so by telling the captain with utmost sincerity that his team was representing the whole nation and that the entire country was behind he and his fellow Springboks. Mandela also raised a question for the Springbok captain to ponder. I find this a fascinating question that all leaders should ask. Here's the question. How do we get the loyal people around us to exceed their own expectations of what they can do? You get the question? How can you bring about in the people around you the awareness that they can exceed their own expectations? So Pienaar and Mandela were able to do just that, each in his own way. Slowly, thoughtfully, and with great respect for each member of the team, Mandela earned the trust of the Springboks. In time, as journalist John Carlin reported, he, Mandela, had won their hearts. And to the surprise of the rugby world, the Springboks earned their way to the World Rugby Finals, which was held in Johannesburg, South Africa. What happened next is best expressed by Richard Stingel in the biography Mandela's Way. Quote, in his most famous gesture of reconciliation, Mandela wore the Springbok jersey and cap to the rugby finals at Johannesburg Park Stadium in 1995. When he strode out before the game to meet the team captain, the mostly white crowd began to chant, "Nelson, Nelson." It was one of the most electrifying moments in the history of sport and politics. Tokoyo Sexwale, who had been in prison with Mandela on Robben Island, told the journalist Carlin, quote, that was the moment when I understood more clearly than ever before that the liberation movement struggle in South Africa was not so much about liberating blacks from bondage as it was about liberating white people from fear. Mandela had attempted the seemingly absurd in order to achieve the almost impossible. He had effected a change in the soul perception of both blacks and whites. They each began to see each other in a more accepting light, and in so doing, they unconsciously expanded and enriched their own sense of selfhood. Now, what I want to do is turn to something that I think is quite remarkable, and you can see crystal clear what I'm in my own limited way trying to make you aware of about how the natural magic in human relationships that's magic for the good actually is real. Now, one of the most paradigmatic occasions in recorded history of high human magic, of accelerated mind transformation, is that of the Buddha's conversion of the robber and assassin Angulimala. The epic confrontation between the Magus teacher, the Buddha, and the merciless bandit Angulimala goes as follows. What happened is this. The Buddha comes with his retinue of monks to the Jeta Grove in northern India. When he comes there, he finds something extraordinary. There's the king. There are all these guards around the town. The villages are empty. And he's wondering, what is going on? And so he goes up to the king and he says, "Oh, king, are you being attacked by another kingdom?" He says, "Oh, no, that's not the problem." "Well, what is the problem, my friend?" "Well," said the king, "it's the bandit and the assassin Angulimala." "Who?" "Angulimala. He means he puts a necklace of fingers around his neck, a necklace of fingers of all the people he killed. He is absolutely unstoppable." The Buddha goes, "Are you telling me that all these guards, who look like they're trembling like leaves, are all of this because of one man?" He said, "Yes, but you don't know what he's like. He's blood-curdling. He defeats everyone. And he wants my fingers." "I see," said the Buddha. "Angulimala has need of the teachings." The disciple said, "What?" He said, "Angulimala has need of the teachings, and I'm going to go give them to him." And right away the king looked horror-stricken. The disciples were completely confused and anxious, as you can imagine. And all of them remonstrated with him. And the Buddha looked at them and said, "Look, let me ask you a question." Nodded. Has anyone ever approached this robber assassin without fear? Has anyone ever approached him with a heart full of love and compassion? Well, no, clearly not. He said, "Well, then how do you know in advance what he's going to do?" He turned to his monks and said, "You prepare all the brothers and sisters to greet him with kindness and respect when I bring him back. And you, O king, remember your promise. You promised that whenever someone took the vows of a Buddhist monk or a Buddhist nun, that you would protect them in certain respects." The king said, "Yes, but what you're doing is impossible." And the monk said, "Sir, please, master, you're going to be killed no matter how bright and full of wisdom you are, and then you're going to deprive all the people of generations to come of your teachings, all because of this one man." And the Buddha said, "Cease and desist." And as he said, "Cease and desist," I go to Angulimala. It is said that a current of compassion was released from the depths of his heart. It swirled out in space, metaphysical space. It surrounded and found apertures in the hard-crusted personality of Angulimala. And already it was beginning its magic, even before he had seen Angulimala. Well, he goes out marching, and Angulimala is standing outside his den in the jungle, and he sees this monk go walking by. He goes, "A single monk goes walking by? What is happening?" And he yells out, "Stop, monk!" And the Buddha, who's at a certain distance, turns, looks at him and says, I have stopped, but you have not stopped." And he turns and he keeps walking. Angulimala goes, "This is ridiculous." And he draws his sword and he goes shouting, "Stop, monk!" And again the Buddha turns around and Angulimala approaches him and he looks at his eyes and they make eye contact. And Angulimala later said to other disciples, he said, "When I looked into his eyes, they were so full of something I couldn't quite understand, but I now understand it was compassion. They were so calm, they were so serene, there was such a sweetness of a smile on his face, and there was not an ounce of fear in him. I felt suddenly strange. I began to feel weak, and my legs went down from under me, and I sat down and I put down my sword. And lo and behold, this monk, he turned and he sat down facing me. And we were quiet for a while. And then I said, and then Angulimala, to get back to the storyline, particular way, he said, "What is it? Why are you here?" And the Buddha said, "O chief, I'm here because you need me." "Need you? All I need is your fingers, really." "And no," the Buddha said, "well, if you need my fingers, I willingly give them. You may cut them off. But you need more than that from me." "Ah, I see. I need more than that from you?" "Yes, you need more than that from me." "Why do you say this?" "I say this because you are somewhere in your soul searching for an adventure far greater than any adventure you have ever undertaken, and for a conquest far beyond any you've ever achieved." "Ah, really?" Angulimala pauses and thinks, this man, he has such a strange effect. I think he's a magician. "Ah, that's what you are, aren't you? You're a magician. Will you teach me magic?" "You are a magician." And the Buddha said, "Well, what I'm talking about is magic, and it's not magic." "I see," said Angulimala. Well, let me now read you what transpires. "I have come," he says, he said, "I come and I offer you the new challenges," as we've heard. And Angulimala says, "Well, this is interesting. And for some reason, you open up new fields for me of conquest, and I would learn the art of magic. I know not why, but I feel I can trust you. Beware, my friend," said the Buddha, "how you trust me. I shall lead you into ways you know not of." Angulimala rose to the challenge. "I am not afraid." Then he added half to himself, "You called me friend. None has called me friend since the days my teacher drove me away because the other disciples didn't like me. I would have a friend, one who stays beside me and who yet is not afraid of me. And now, O monk, what is this adventure greater than I have yet conceived, this conquest worthy of man? It is the adventure of the eightfold path that leads to conquest of yourself." "Of myself?" asked Angulimala in dignity. But all the world is afraid of me except you. Why should I want to conquer myself? Because you, friend, are the slave of your lust for power and domination. You can no more stop your desire for further conquest than you can stop the gray hairs which gather upon your brow. Angulimala was now beginning to think, beginning to wonder. And he murmurs to himself, adventure, power. Yes, replied the Buddha, but this adventure will bring you pain and suffering. I've never feared pain and suffering, said Angulimala again, rising to the challenge. The Buddha said, it will take long and the way will be arduous. I've always had patience and hard working has been my delight. And you will learn the meaning of fear. I, who have never known fear? Yes, you who have never known fear. What is it I should fear? The evil deeds you have done. I do not understand, but I know I can trust you, and that you hold before me the challenge of the greatest of all adventures. Master, I follow you. So he follows him back. The king is beside himself because he's bound by a vow that he cannot do any harm to Angulimala. The Buddhist monks are quasi-terrified, but they're also more afraid of disobeying the Buddha than they are of anything else. So they treat him with respect. Then going out to the community, the villages, for lunch, for begging for food for lunch, and also giving the teachings if the villagers ask, Angulimala has to go out with them. And the Buddha warns him, when you go to the villagers, they are not going to look upon you kindly. And he said, yes, I understand. He goes out, he comes back, he's beaten up, he's bleeding, and one eye has been poked out. And he lies on the ground, and his other disciples go to attend to him. And the Buddha, something that I know Gandhi also did, the Buddha went to him and said, now, Angulimala, you are now beginning to pay the cost that come from the harm you've done to so many people. Do you regret you've taken your vows? No, I do not regret it. When I was being beaten, something strange happened. I suddenly found my mind in a place of such peace that I had never experienced before. And I realized every one of them is afraid of me. And that was difficult to bear, to think that I frightened so many people, harmed so many people, and yet there is a place in the mind, in consciousness, which apparently you can touch through suffering. And it is more worthwhile than any other thing I can imagine. So no, I have no regrets. Now, what is interesting is that he went on to be a monk. And he, in fact, there are, what was it? There was a, he went on to be a monk. So let me now just comment on this before I come to the ending part. Now, in this dramatic historical encounter, we can readily discern the two opposite poles of human potential, the self-enlightened and the self-deluded. The sage, the Buddha, is beyond even our most exalted conception of individuation. He is para-individuated. He is suffused with transcendent wisdom and unconditional compassion, while the deluded Angulimala is steeped in spiritual ignorance, rampant passion, and ever-flowing arrogance. The Buddha's mind is as luminous as 1,000 suns, while Angulimala's mind is defiled, lunar, and destined for states of woe. Fortunately for Anguillamala, he came into personal contact with the Buddha, an individual who had conquered the ego myriad lifetimes ago, and could instantly understand the degraded condition of the disfigured and depraved Anguillamala. The robber was suffering from acute soul sickness. As a consummate spiritual physician, Gautama Buddha saw the medicine needed and the self-transmutation required. If Anguillamala took the medicine offered by the Buddha, the Noble Eightfold Path, then self-regeneration was possible, but was by no means guaranteed. Now, at the end of their extraordinary dialogue in the jungle, Anguillamala, chastised and humbled, came to see that he must attempt the seemingly impossible. He must attempt to visualize the possibility of enlightenment while inhabiting a debased mind. He must somehow see beyond himself. His initial act of self-transcendence was to place his trust in the Buddha and be humble before the teachings. But he must also awaken his mind. He must arouse his rational moral awareness. How could Anguillamala do this? How could he overcome the inertia of lives of self-indulgent passions and of mental sloth? It is not enough that the Buddha's compassion was at work on the inner planes, fertilizing the seed of intuitive intelligence within Anguillamala. More was needed. Anguillamala's mind must in some way be stimulated, challenged, and inspired. This is where the confrontational dialogue between the Buddha and Anguillamala proved pivotal. Anguillamala could not initiate a spiritual conversation with himself. The Buddha knew this, and so he initiated a dialogue between them by giving Anguillamala a vision of a battle more glorious than all other battles. The battle was for spiritual freedom. Through Anguillamala's initial ego-centered questions and Buddha's frank but encouraging answers, Anguillamala became more authentically focused and sincere about the path of transfiguration. Interestingly enough, Anguillamala and Buddha's dialogue in the jungle is surprisingly Platonic because it is so essentially and existentially genuine. Each is in dead earnest. Their intense, pointed dialogue is spiritual engagement at a high level. Each questions the other. However, unlike Anguillamala, the Buddha's speech is surcharged with logoic light. It is illuminating, healing, and purifying. He points Anguillamala towards spiritual north and challenges him to undertake the perilous quest. Accordingly, Anguillamala is inspired to do so on the spot, and on the spot he takes the vow of a Buddhist monk. By the end of his long life, Anguillamala is recognized by members of the Sangha as a saint, and it is said that 2 verses in the Dhammapada were spoken by the Buddha as a tribute to Anguillamala, and those 2 verses are as follows. Whosoever by a good deed covers the evil done brightens the world like the moon freed from clouds. And the second one, this world is wrapped in darkness. Few there be who can see in this world. Only few are those who can go to realms of bliss like birds escaping from a nest. Now, this is my closing thoughts. Magic is ubiquitous. It is in nature and in man. It occurs wherever and whenever spirit and matter creatively coalesce through the agency of a purified intelligence. If this is true, then isn't it a wonderful thought, my friends, to think that at this very moment, in time, there are literally hundreds of millions of magicians on our good globe. Who are they, you ask? They are the babies of every culture. Every baby is a natural unconscious magician. Babies are pure vehicles of the light of the immanent spirit, of the Atman. Their personal mind is incipient and cannot impede the undulating flow of the spirit. Babies radiate the sweet efflux of buddhi through their spontaneous laughter, their delightful curiosity, and their sympathetic responses to their mother's happiness and sorrows. Babies breathe purity and goodness. And what of the child between the ages of 3 and 7, before the higher faculties begin to incarnate, and long before the onset of puberty and its disorienting effects? The growing child is engaged in the holy activity of learning and the power that comes from knowledge. Think of it. To the young boy or girl, the world has just been created. To the young, inquisitive mind, fiat lux, or let there be light, is today and every day. Each discovery is an original to the young child. The growing learner cares not for history or for ego. It is full of love and trust and possesses an unblemished imagination. Parents and teachers are held in awe. What is more, young children freely and willingly embrace diverse legends and stories of human bravery and self-sacrifice. They live in a golden age for a while, and wise parents do their best to help them carry that attitude forward when they enter formal education. All in all, to young children, magic is existentially real. It doesn't need any explanations. And what of adults? We are more blessed than we realize. The great brotherhood of bodhisattvas, the greatest of magicians, are ever at work in multiple orbits across the globe. In addition, there are secular hotris among us as well. There are undoubtedly unknown Lincolns, Eisenhowers, Mandelas, and Gandhis hidden in plain sight. They are content to live their lives in ordinary roles this time and quietly go about their sublime dharma unnoticed. If we look with an open mind and a heart untainted by cynicism, we will see them. There is another class of adults whose very bhakti, or devotion, does magic. What do I mean? What I mean is that enlightened minds can awaken other minds and inspire other hearts across cultures and historical epochs, but only when devotion is present. Time and geography are myopic, deceptive to those who revere great teachers. For example, when the true devotee of Jesus turns daily to the New Testament to replenish his spirit and purify his mind, he is unconsciously declaring that Jesus is living, vital, and present in the words and images of his teachings. Such an earnest devotee is not only rising above time and culture, but more importantly, he is rising above the gravitational pull of his own mindset. It is an act of pure communion with the spirit of his teacher. For a while, the devotee is bringing Jesus forward into the present moment, into his or her own mental world, and letting Jesus' teaching shed their revelatory light on the complex labyrinth of his or her daily duties. Millions of dedicated devotees of the world's diverse religions experience this daily, even though they might not consciously think of it as magic. But it is magic because it transforms the mind and regenerates the heart. Beyond these millions of bhaktis across the globe, there are those innocents among us who are inexperienced in the perverted and torturous ways of the world. They are spiritually vaccinated and are immune to the cynicism and dystopian thinking of the worldly wise and politically ambitious. They are patient and trust that the best is yet to be. They look forward, not backward, and they look beyond the miasma of the present too. Let me say in closing that I believe in human magic. Human magic is real and ubiquitous. The Bodhisattva's magical emanations are spontaneous, benevolent, and uplifting. They touch the hearts of the ready, the reverential, and the receptive of every level of life and in every condition whatsoever. I wish you all the very best for the coming year and for the decades ahead as we enter more fully into the Aquarian age. And I will close with this comment that I heard recently. that I think is apropos. Remember, yesterday is history. Tomorrow is a mystery. The present and today actually is a gift, right? Today is a gift. That's why they call it the present. So I wish you all the best in the new year. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. James Tepfer, for that interesting walkthrough on certain magical moments of our world history. I am most certain that some of us will be dusting our history books and consult the biographies of these eminent statesmen, Lincoln, Eisenhower, Mandela, plus rugby. So, on that note, again, thank you, Dr. Tepfer, and I am Charlie Romero from the Philippines, wishing everyone a pleasant evening ahead. This session of the public lecture of Dr. Tepfer is deemed closed. Thank you very much for your kind attention.